Welcome back, Honors. All right. Glad that you guys could actually use that knockoff flip that I accidentally recorded for the wrong group yesterday. But you know what? It's all good. We're going to keep getting after it, all right? So we are pretty much going to focus today on the spread of the Renaissance, right? And we are going to have a review in class. We're going to talk about the writings of the Renaissance. Then we're going to keep doing our art presentations. And look, these art presentations are going to take a while, all right? So they're going to take a pretty good amount of time, into next week. You know what I mean? Just because they take some time. You gotta take the time to appreciate this art, right? So in a sense though, these next few flips are ones that we're not gonna review heavy, but you do need to make sure you're focusing on them and that you're actually really paying attention and really getting ready to review pretty hardcore for them, all right? So anyway, but the Renaissance itself is going to spread northward, right? So when we say north, what are we talking about here? We're talking mostly about its spread outside of Italy, all right? So it's spreading north to places like England, France, Germany, all right? So really quick, you should cross out the word Germany and underneath put Holy Roman Empire because the country of Germany didn't exist yet, right? It didn't exist. It was actually called the Holy Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire contained places like Germany, or modern day Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, Belgium, part of Austria, Liechtenstein, right? So a lot of these large, culturally diverse areas. And anyway, but as things get traded and as economics begin to spread outside of Italy and other countries end up making their own money, then the Renaissance ideals and also that intelligence is going to spread right along with it, right? But the cool thing about it is northern art is wildly different from Italian art, right? And a lot of it has to do with different things like this invention, right? So the printing press, right? So the printing press is going to be developed by a man named Johannes Gutenberg, right? Printing press. Do one little quick thing. I gotta just check for something. Rotisserie press. Ew. Here we go. Printing press, woodblock printing. Yeah, there we go. So, all right, Johannes Gutenberg around the 1440s. So when Michelangelo was doing actually he's not even born yet, but before Michelangelo's even born, before Da Vinci's even born, before any of these guys truly start making their mark on the Renaissance itself, you had guys like Johannes Gutenberg, right? And in the 1440s, he develops this thing called the printing press. Now, what he actually develops is this thing called the rip-off machine. All right, now, anyway, something you need to know is that the printing press had existed for over 1,000 years, right? So the Asians had been using them for over 1,000 years. During their Eastern Golden Age, they were using them to track a documentation of money and the movement of product and stuff like that. But the big stinky part of the Asiatic design of the printing press is it was made out of wood blocks, right? So these little things called types. Every type is what it is a letter on a block, right? So for example, think of Scrabble, right? When you're playing Scrabble, those are little types, right? Think of a typewriter, right? A typewriter, when you hit the key, it goes, yeah, and it sends a little metal printed letter, and it hits a ribbon, and it places that on paper, right? So that's a type, all right? So Johannes Gutenberg changed the game, though, because he created a metal type printing press. He took the idea that the Asians had for over 1,000 years, and he made the types themselves out of metal to make them more durable, because these wooden printing presses actually had a habit of falling apart a lot. The ink would soak into the wood block and they had to be replaced every now and again. But this development of the printing press is going to allow the Renaissance to spread north, to continue its advancement throughout the rest of Europe, right? So, of course, the very, very first book that was ever printed on this printing press was the Bible, right? So printed books became cheaper, right? And the printing press and the printing revolution is also a really, really big deal because it's the spread of intelligence, right? It's making these books cheaper. It's printing the Bible cheaper. It's known as the Gutenberg Bible. It's the very first Bible actually printed on this printing press. And it's making literacy and literature easily exposable to all classes. I guess I'm trying to talk so fast. Exposable to all classes of society, right? So literacy rates are going to begin to climb, much like the intelligence levels of the Renaissance are going to begin to climb, right? And with the ample amount of technology from the Asiatic communities and paper-making technology that they had learned from the Muslims in North Africa, Europeans are going to use this device not only to spread intelligence, but even later on, to spread controversial ideas, right? So and then you're going to see a massive boom in the northern countries as well. So northern artists are going to be wildly different. You know what? Don't write this down. Don't write this down. Let's make a little T-chart instead, right? So give me a little T-chart, okay? And we're going to put the differences between Renaissance and Italian and Northern art, right? So you're going to have a T-chart. It's going to say Italian. It's going to say Northern, all right? So let's go ahead and make a couple bullet-pointed lists of how you know Italian Renaissance art is Italian, right? You know Italian art is Italian when it shows a following of a couple of characteristics. One, frescoes, right? Most of your Northern or Italian artists are very, very heavily using mediums like fresco or marble sculpting or Romanesque architecture, right? So those things are Italian-centered. Also, you have a heavy use of bright colors, right? So in Italian art. Italian art also has Greek and Roman figures in them, right? So gods and goddesses and things like that. That's how you kind of just look at it and you're like, that's Italian art right there, right? So also speaking of, Italian art tends to be a little bit more humanistic in a sense, right? So humanistic in a sense of the figures are exposing the qualities of the human body or maybe hyperbolizing parts of the human body or the human form. For example, when Michelangelo did The Last Judgment, everyone is just jacked, right? They're absolutely huge. And that's a style of Michelangelo, an Italian Renaissance artist, right? Then you have your northern artists, right? Your northern artists use more muted colors, right? So darker usually, okay? So a little bit of a darker context. Second of all, they depict real people. They mostly depict people that are merchants, the wealthy, poor people even sometimes. They depict actual secular things much more than they they actually depict Roman gods and goddesses, all right? Which is a very, very Italian art perspective. And then the third and last thing, hyper detailed, right? Northern artists are hyper detailed. And it's seen in one particular artist in his whole entire scheme. Now, what you need to do, really quick, do not write all this. Just write what engraving is, right? An example, now this is now outside of the T-chart. This is just an example of how Northern art is wildly different from Italian art, right? So an engraving or a woodcut, as they're called, right? Perfected by this guy, Albrecht Dürer, known as the Northern Leonardo, who was a phenomenal painter, but he was a master engraver, right? So engraving is a good example of Northern art because it actually is when an artist cuts a design into a metal plate or a wooden plate using an acid-dipped pen, right? They're going to cut that design into it, and then they're going to eat away at this entire image, and they're going to create a negative of an image, right? So they're basically going to create, you remember those rubber stamps when you were little? Now you take it and you dip it in the ink and you dip it on paper, right? Imagine that in reverse, all right? So imagine that you made your stamp, much like you did in art. I know Mr. Coney, they're making them in art class right now. They're chiseling away at some foam blocks, and they're making stamps, right? So imagine you made that, but then you took that stamp and you loaded it into a printing press using that technology that Gutenberg bestowed upon Europe, right? So taking that, loading it into a printing press, and then dabbing ink on top of it, taking a piece of paper, sliding it in, bang, you now have a completely different type of artwork that no one has ever seen, right? So you've got things for example, the Melancholia. You've got, there we go. You've got Melancholia, right? You've got the Rhinoceros by Dürer. You've got the Night, Death, and the Devil. Those are actual engraving or woodcuts showing a different perspective of Northern Renaissance art, right? So then you've got guys like this who are Northern Renaissance artists. He's a Dutch painter, right? His name is Jan van Eyck. Not Jan van, not Eck. All right, so Jan van Eyck, right? So Jan van Eyck is a big one that actually shows us the hyper detailed, right? We're going to be going over this one a little bit later on in class, but let's focus on his self-portrait, right? So this is his self-portrait of himself. Look at the folds of the fabric. Look at the his brush strokes are invisible. You cannot see where his brushstrokes are, and it looks like this thing that is on top of his head this hat that's on top of his head has so much depth and proportion and shading. This also, notice the muted colors. The bright color is only the red, trying to show you the detail of the painting, right? So that's another example of a Northern Renaissance artist. But then also, there are going to be Northern Renaissance writers. So we talked in the last flip about Petrarch, Machiavelli, Dante, Baldassare Castiglione, and St. Thomas Aquinas, right? These early Renaissance writers. As the Renaissance spreads north, you're going to see Northern Renaissance writers, right? Some of the biggest and most prominent Northern Renaissance writers include people like Shakespeare, right? So Shakespeare is considered a very late Renaissance writer, right? Even though some people believe he wasn't even real. So some people believe it was actually a group of people that all operated under the same pen name. But William Shakespeare, if we're going to pretend that he actually is a real person, was a playwright who focused on realistic characters, right? He wrote the Romeo and Juliet story about a divided family in Verona, right? He wrote Midsummer Night's Dream on fantastic former mythological characters, right? He's bringing those ideas back. He did King Oedipus. He did The Tempest. He did all these amazing things, and he's a late Renaissance writer, right? So, and then you've also got a guy like Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More was a Northern Renaissance writer as well from England and an advisor to Henry VIII himself. He ends up kind of losing his head a little bit later on, but he wrote a very, very famous book called The Utopia. And the Utopia was kind of a crazy fictional story about an island that was a self-contained community that operated perfectly, right? And it was very, very, very brash and kind of crazy for its time, because it talked about how people could easily get divorced. It talked about how they didn't need money anymore. No one was greedy. They actually bound slaves with golden chains and peat in golden chamber pots, right? Because they didn't need gold, because they were all helping each other, right? So it's almost like early communist in a sense, but of course it's wildly fictionalized, and it's got all kinds of other crazy stuff. And it's also one of the euthanasia was a big thing. If you got old enough and you didn't want to be alive anymore, you could just be killed by somebody in the community willingly, right? Because it was a kind thing to do. The Utopia was a crazy book because it was completely fictionalized, and it was an image of his mind, right? So a lot of people actually took it as a criticism of the Catholic Church, and then other people also took it as it all depends on how you interpret it. Other people took it as a big glowing representation of monasteries and convents for the Catholic Church, right? So Sir Thomas More is another very, very famous Northern Renaissance writer, of course, writing the Utopia. And I know that y'all talked about him in religion as well. But I think this is where we're going to stop, all right? And that's the Northern Renaissance. And then we're going to keep focusing on our artworks in class, and we're just going to keep on cruising, all right? But I'll see you guys later. Y'all have a great one.